Good morning, my name is Dawn Taylor, and this is a multimedia presentation for Epistemology and Worldview, BEH 333-BE, on social psychological research and Christian faith, the Stanford prison experiment and biblical lessons of morality, comparing and contrasting the results of the Stanford prison experiment to Jesus' arrest and trial. The Stanford prison experiment was conducted in the summer of 1971 at Stanford University by Philip Zimbardo and his associates. Male college students were recruited through a local newspaper and then interviewed and tested for psychological problems, disabilities, or negative background information such as criminal or drug abuse. 24 students were selected by this process and divided by the flip of a coin into two groups, representing either guards or prisoners. According to Professor Zimbardo, the purpose of this study was to find out what happens when you put good people in an evil place. Does the institution control your behavior, or does one's inner morality and character rise above the negative environment? The results of the Stanford prison experiment were unique and possibly influenced by the time. The Stanford prison experiment was conducted during a time of social unrest, where the establishment and law enforcement were viewed as oppressive and abusive, especially by the academic universities. This attitude can be seen in Professor Zimbardo's use of the terms as prison being evil, and also to the study's objective as seeing how people react to an extremely oppressive regime, that regime being the police force. The regime in Zimbardo's experiment was a group of young male college students dressed up as stereotyped Southern sheriff-type guards, complete with mirrored sunglasses and billy clubs. These young men had no formal training and no clear guidelines other than to maintain law and order, and the instructions that they couldn't use physical violence. The results of the experiment were one or more students who were chosen as guards became excessively aggressive towards the students who portrayed prisoners. Other guards didn't speak up to protect students who were prisoners. Prisoners became divided and also turned against one prisoner who was standing up for their rights during the hunger strike, as well as another prisoner who just wanted to leave. The student guards and prisoners also lost sight of reality, including Professor Zimbardo. And purely looking at the results of the Stanford prison experiment without calling into question the study's validity itself, I believe that some comparable biblical points can be seen in the story of Jesus' arrest and treatment before his crucifixion. The first point being obviously the excessively aggressive guards in comparison with the excessively aggressive guards in the biblical view. Excessive aggression on the part of the guard or guards in both instances, particularly the passage in Luke, seems familiar to the Stanford experiment with the use of blindfolds and mocking voice. Luke 22:63 states, "The men who were guarding Jesus began mocking and beating him. They blindfolded him and demanded, 'Prophesy, who has beat you?' And they said many other insulting things to him." For the second point, people refused to speak up in both instances when they saw mistreatment. The majority of the guards in the Stanford experiment were not aggressive, but passively stood by as the John Wayne guard became more sadistic. Additionally, Professor Zimbardo, who was acting as the warden in this experiment, stood by passively rather than interfere with the out-of-control guard. This is similar to Pilate's interaction with the Jewish leaders when referring to Jesus. Pilate states in John 19:10, when talking to Jesus, "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Don't you realize I have the power to either free you or crucify you?" However, later, although he found no fault in Jesus, instead of sparing him as was just, he sent him to be crucified to appease the people. For point 3, the prisoners became divided and turned against one of their own, just as the apostles and Peter in particular turns against Jesus by denying him. The prisoners in the experiment had in common their youth, college status, and unity as pretend prisoners in the experiment. Yet they turned against one prisoner who wanted to leave and another who went on a hunger strike. This is similar to Peter's denial of association with Jesus, but also to a greater extent the Jewish crowds flip-flopped from loving and adoring Jesus when he first came to Jerusalem to hating him and to crucify him. Luke 23:18 and 21 say, "But the whole crowd shouted, 'Away with this man, release Barabbas to us.'" And in 21, "But they kept shouting, 'Crucify him, crucify him.'" For the last point in this, prisoner 416 went on a hunger strike to protest the prisoners being held against their will, but was betrayed by all of the prisoners and looked at as an enemy rather than a hero. This can be compared to Jesus' final act of sacrifice, where he sacrificed his life for us on the cross while we were still sinners and while many of us were still enemies to him. The result of the experiment in the short term was that during the experiment no action was taken against the aggression. After the experiment, students were offered an encounter group where all students were encouraged to participate and air their grievances. The major changes that were made in the part of experimental procedures in psychology, and this study stands as an example in how human rights can be violated and how easily a researcher can lose his perspective when involved directly in a research project. The results of Jesus' incarceration in the short term, of course, the actions of the guards, Pilate, and Jewish crowds resulted in the death of Jesus, fulfilling prophecy of his death and resurrection. Jesus forgave his people, and Peter in particular after his resurrection. Peter became one of the leaders of the Christian church, and Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection led to the Savior of mankind. In contrasting and comparing the consequences of the Stanford experiment with the consequences of the Stanford experiment helped to solidify ethics for psychological experimentation, such as not acting to the detriment of people, acting in the benefit of people as individuals and in the whole, autonomy, justice, and fidelity. In contrast, the apostles continued to struggle after Jesus' death and resurrection and continued to be persecuted while spreading his message continually to the point of being martyred for their faith. When comparing the two, no action was taken based on the authorities of the time for either the guards, and also both the experiment and Jesus' arrest led to major changes in both psychological experimentation and the establishment of the Christian faith. When we reflect on looking at the human behavior of both the Stanford experiment and the arrest and trial, we can see that human behavior can be cruel and demeaning at times, seeking to exhibit power over those weaker than themselves. Often human reactions to this seeing other people doing bad things is to ignore, because it makes us feel uneasy inside, and a lot of people don't have a confrontational personality. Also, we tend to revert to a self-preservation role when life becomes tough. We saw this both in the Stanford prison experiment with Peter, and also in the other jail experiments, and when referring to the Nazi camp. And a lot of times people are just trying to preserve their own health and welfare. We often seek short-term comfort and complacency over short-term discomfort for an unknown outcome. So a lot of us might not be risk takers and are more worried about the negative outcomes of doing something that's risky rather than the positive things that can happen. We as humans often seek to find something or someone to blame for our condition of suffering. We see this in the people, the general Jewish people, having so much hatred towards Jesus and blaming him, and also the other prisoners blaming the prisoners who stood up for their own rights and were put in the hole. When talking about what faith can guide us, I would say that the first thing that comes to mind when talking about our own faith and being guided by our faith would be to use biblical teaching about how God wants us to live. Matthew 22:36 and through 40, Matthew 22:36-40 in particular, about the first and greatest commandments Jesus gives us to love God with all our heart and our soul and our mind, and then the second, to love one another. There's some additional Bible verses about not doing to others, or doing to others what we want to have them do to us, as well as to not be in bad company because it ruins our good morals, and also to show yourself in all respects to be a model of good works, and in your teaching show integrity, dignity, and sound speech that cannot be condemned, so that an opponent may be put to shame, having nothing evil to say about us. In closing, exploring other outcomes, I believe that if Professor Zimbardo and his team were operating on faith-based principles alone and looking at it from that perspective, the outcome of the experiment may have been different. Professor Zimbardo may have gotten someone else to become warden in the experiment so that he could remain more objective during the experiment. Also, Professor Zimbardo may have set stronger guidelines for ethical treatments of subjects, specifically when looking in comparison with biblical principles. The parents of the students may not have been deceived when they came to the experiment site, because this would be against biblical principle, and also students may have the understanding that they could have left the program at any time. In addition, the treatment, the guards would have been specifically told to treat in a biblical manner the prisoners, and so this would have set a different tone overall for the experiment. But it would not have been the outcome that Professor Zimbardo was looking for, which was to confirm his hypothesis, I believe, in what he was seeing out in the larger world. So I believe this this specific experiment was slightly slanted to get the outcome that Professor Zimbardo was looking for. All right, thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed my video.